You're listening to the final frequency. Last broadcast, Chernobyl. Tonight, the cleanup. And the word itself is where we have to begin. The Soviet state called them liquidators, liquidators. The men and women sent into the contaminated zone in the months and years after April 26, 1986 to, and here the official language performs its usual function, liquidate the consequences of the accident. Liquidate the consequences. You cannot liquidate radiation. You cannot negotiate with a half-life. What you can do is place human bodies between the contamination and the rest of the world. You can have hands pick up what machines fail to pick up. You can have lungs filter what the air carries. And if you control the records, you can ensure that what those bodies absorb is never accurately written down anywhere that history can find it. Over the course of the cleanup, the Soviet Union mobilized, by the most defensible estimates, around 600,000 people. Some figures run lower, some higher. We will talk about why the figure itself is contested, because the contest is the story. 600,000. Soldiers, reservists, miners, engineers, bus drivers, helicopter pilots, men pulled from ordinary lives by a military summons that did not say where they were going. Most of them went. Some of them volunteered, and I want to say that clearly at the outset, because this episode is an indictment of a system, not of the people it spent. Many of those people behaved with a courage that the system did not deserve and has never adequately honored. Tonight, who they were, what they were told, what was actually done to them, and how the medical truth of what happened to 600,000 human beings was deliberately, systematically, and in some respects permanently erased. This is last broadcast. These are the liquidators. And this is the part of Chernobyl the reactor did not do. The system did this part itself. Let me start on the roof of Reactor 3. After the explosion, the roof of the adjacent reactor building was covered in debris from the destroyed core. Chunks of graphite moderator, fragments of fuel assemblies, material so radioactive that exposure was measured not in safe shifts, but in seconds. The plan was to clear it with machines. The Soviets brought in robots, their own and West German units procured in haste, lunar rover technology, remote-controlled bulldozers. The robots died. The radiation flux on that roof was intense enough to destroy their electronics. Circuits failed, cameras whited out. Machines built to operate on the moon stopped functioning on a rooftop in Ukraine. So the state turned to what it called, in a phrase that I want you to sit with, biological robots. Biorobots. That is the term that appears in accounts from the operation. Human beings, designated by a word that preemptively stripped them of the inconvenience of being human. The men, mostly military reservists, were dressed in improvised lead aprons, sheets of lead cut and hung over their bodies, and sent onto the roof in relays. Each man was permitted one run. The runs were timed, 40 seconds, 60 seconds, 90, depending on the sector and the readings. In that time, a man would run to a piece of graphite, shovel it over the edge into the ruin of Reactor 4 below, and run back. One run, a few seconds of work. And in those seconds, Many of them absorbed what official guidance considered the maximum allowable dose for an entire emergency, and in numerous cases, far beyond it. Approximately 3,500 men worked the roof. They were given certificates. Some received a bonus. Accounts mentioned sums of around 100 rubles. Some were promised early discharge from their reserve duty. What they were not given was the truth about the numbers on the dosimeters, where there were dosimeters at all. We talked 2 episodes ago about instruments that pinned at their maximum and were set aside as broken. On the roof, the practice evolved into something more administrative. Doses were frequently recorded not from individual measurement, but by assignment, a standard figure written into a man's file for a shift, regardless of where on the roof he had been or what he had actually absorbed. The record was not a measurement. The record was a quota. And a man whose file says he received an acceptable dose is a man whose cancer 10 years later officially has no cause. Hold that mechanism in your mind. We will see it again and again tonight. It is the central machine of this entire episode. Control the number at the moment of exposure, and you control the diagnosis for the rest of that man's life. The lie was not added later. The lie was installed at the source. Two more groups. Because the Liquidators were not one story. They were hundreds of thousands of stories, and tonight I can only carry a few of them, and I have chosen the ones that show the machine most clearly. The miners first. In the weeks after the explosion, Soviet scientists feared the molten core, the lava of fuel and sand and concrete still burning its way downward, might reach the water table beneath the reactor. The proposed solution was to dig a tunnel under Reactor 4 and install a cooling system in the space beneath the foundation. Roughly 400 miners were brought from the coal basins, Donbass men, Tula men. They dug a tunnel approximately 150 meters long, by hand, in conditions that reached intolerable heat, beneath an open reactor. Ventilation in the tunnel was minimal to non-existent. Forced air risked stirring radioactive dust. Accounts from the miners describe working in temperatures around 50 degrees. Many worked stripped to the waist. No respirators that functioned in that heat. No meaningful dosimetry underground. They finished the tunnel in around 6 weeks, a pace that peacetime engineering would call impossible. The cooling system it was built for was, in the end, never installed as designed. The space was filled with concrete. The core never reached the water table. Whether it ever would have remains debated. The tunnel, in other words, may not have been needed. The miners were not told that either. Now the pilots. In the first days, before the tunnel, before the roof, the immediate problem was the open core itself, burning in the air. The response was to smother it from above. Helicopter crews flew directly over the breach, over the open throat of the reactor, and dropped sand, lead, clay, boron. Thousands of flights, the worst of them in the first week, when the radiation directly above the core was at levels that the crew's own instruments could not meaningfully report. The pilots flew anyway, run after run. Some crews flew dozens of sorties over that opening. The air above the core in those first days was, by any honest reckoning, among the most dangerous airspace human beings have ever voluntarily entered. Many of those pilots sickened in the months and years after. The dose records for the early flights are, you will be unsurprised to hear the word by now, incomplete. Incomplete. Unavailable. Liquidated. The vocabulary of this event is remarkably consistent once you learn to hear it. I interviewed a former helicopter engineer in Kyiv in 1996. He serviced machines that flew the core in the first week. He told me the aircraft themselves became so contaminated that some were eventually driven into the vehicle graveyards of the zone and abandoned. Hundreds of machines, helicopters, fire engines, armored vehicles, too radioactive to ever leave. He said something I have thought about for 30 years. He said, "They buried the machines with more care than they counted the men." They buried the machines with more care than they counted the men. That sentence is this episode. Everything else I will say tonight is footnotes to it. Now we come to the documents. And I want to be precise, because what happened to the medical truth of the liquidators was not a single act of suppression. It was an architecture, built deliberately, maintained for years. And I am going to describe 3 of its load-bearing walls. Wall 1. Classification at the source. In the summer of 1986, directives circulated within the Soviet health system concerning how radiation-related illness among cleanup personnel was to be recorded. Documents that came to light in the late 80s and after the Union's collapse describe explicit instruction that acute radiation syndrome and related conditions were not to be freely diagnosed in liquidators. That diagnoses were to be routed through restricted channels, and that in ordinary records, other causes were to be preferred. You will remember Valentina in Pripyat on the first morning, ordered to log radiation sickness as chemical exposure. Within weeks, that improvisation had become policy. Vegetative vascular dystonia, a vague Soviet diagnostic basket, roughly meaning nervous dysregulation, became the recorded explanation for a generation of sick men. A man vomits, his hair falls out, his blood counts collapse. His file says, nervous condition. Wall 2, the 35 rem ceiling. Official dose registries operated under thresholds, where a man's accumulated paper dose approached the ceiling that would trigger obligations, medical follow-up, compensation, removal from duty. The recorded doses had a way of arriving at figures just beneath it. Researchers who later compared biological dosimetry, chromosome damage in liquidators' blood, which does not read directives, against the paper registries found systematic divergence. The blood said more. The paper said enough and no further. The blood said more. The paper said enough. Wall 3. Time. The registries of liquidators, who served, where, for how long, were scattered across republics that in 1991 became separate countries. Records were lost, withheld, or never centralized. Follow-up studies that should have tracked 600,000 people for life instead track fragments. and every gap in the data has been used for 40 years in the same direction. Where the data is missing, the official position has been no proven connection. The data is missing because it was made to go missing, and then its absence was cited as proof of safety. I want to say that again, because it is the single most important mechanism in this entire series. They destroyed the evidence, and then they pointed at the empty space where the evidence had been and said, "You see? Nothing there." The reactor failed in one night. The numbers were made to fail across 4 decades. And yet, this is the part of the story the architects of the paper wall did not anticipate, or anticipated and could not prevent. Truth at this scale leaks. Bodies are their own archive, and 40 years is long enough for some of the suppressed signal to surface through the noise. So let me tell you what can be established, carefully, with the error bars showing, because we owe the truth the dignity of precision, especially after everything done to blur it. The official, internationally endorsed figure for deaths directly attributable to Chernobyl, the one descended from joint assessments in the 2000s, stands at around several dozen confirmed acute deaths and a projected toll among the most exposed populations of roughly 4,000 eventual cancer deaths. 4,000. You will see that number in summaries to this day. Independent and regional assessments, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Russian, academic and governmental, produce projections that run far higher. Tens of thousands in some models, well beyond that in others, depending on assumptions about low-dose effects across the wider exposed populations of Europe. I am not going to stand here and tell you which model is correct. That would make me a mirror image of the men who wrote 3.6 on a telex. What I am going to tell you is why the range exists. The range exists because the baseline data that would narrow it was deliberately corrupted at the source. The dose records were quotas. The diagnoses were redirected. The registries were fragmented. 40 years of honest epidemiology has been forced to work downstream of 1986's dishonesty. The uncertainty is not natural. The uncertainty was manufactured. It is the longest-lasting structure the Soviet Union ever built. The reactors are entombed. The Union is gone. The uncertainty is still in service. What is not uncertain? Thyroid cancer among those who were children in the contaminated regions in 1986 rose sharply in the following decades. Thousands of cases, a rise so steep and so specific that even the most conservative international bodies attribute it to the iodine releases of the accident. That, at least, broke through the wall. It broke through because childhood thyroid cancer was rare enough that the signal could not be hidden inside any baseline. The children, in other words, were the data the system could not blur. That is what it took. That is what it took. I want to leave the numbers now and return to the men. Because registries and REM ceilings are how the system saw them, and this broadcast exists to see them otherwise. In 1996, and again in 2003, I traveled to Kiev and to Minsk and recorded interviews with former liquidators. Some spoke on tape. Some spoke only after the tape was off. I'm going to give you 3 voices, with details adjusted only as far as protection requires. The first man was a reservist who worked decontamination in the villages. The crews that washed buildings, stripped topsoil, shot the abandoned livestock and pets so they would not spread contamination beyond the zone. He spoke about the dogs for most of our interview, not the radiation, the dogs. He said, "They ran to us when we arrived. They were waiting for their owners, you understand. They saw the trucks and thought the people were coming back." He did not finish that thought on tape. He did not need to. The second was a roof man. One run, 60 seconds, 1986. He showed me his certificate of gratitude, a printed sheet, his name in careful ink. He kept it framed. He was by then ill in several of the ways the registries do not connect to anything. His pension dispute had been running for 9 years. His recorded dose sat, he laughed when he told me, comfortably under every threshold that would have made the state owe him. He said, "My dose is healthy. It is the only part of me that is." The third voice I will give you was a widow. Her husband drove buses in the evacuation of Pripyat. April 27th, the convoy of more than 1,000 buses, the 3-day lie. He drove families out, then went back in, multiple trips. Then he spent that summer driving Liquidators between camps and the plant. He died in the early 90s. His file attributed it to causes unconnected to service. She told me she had stopped fighting the file. She said, "I know what he did. The neighbors know what he did. God knows what he did. The file is for people who were not there. The file is for people who were not there." 600,000 stories. I have given you 5 across 2 episodes. It is not enough. It was never going to be enough. But the arithmetic of remembrance is strange. It does not require completeness. It requires only that the count never be allowed to reach 0. Tonight, the count is not 0. That is the job. We are doing the job. Two episodes ago, Valentina gave this series its mandate. "Silence has a face," she said. It sat in a room and looked at a piece of paper that told it the truth, and chose a different piece of paper. I told you we would try to find that face. So let us be precise about what can and cannot be named after 40 years. Some faces history has already named. The plant management and engineers were tried in 1987. The director, the chief engineer, his deputy, among others, in a proceeding held with grim appropriateness inside the exclusion zone itself. Men were sentenced to labor camps. Some of the convicted were genuinely culpable in the operational failures of that night. And the trial was also, simultaneously, an act of containment. By prosecuting the men at the plant, the state drew a line around the catastrophe at the perimeter fence. The reactor's design flaws, known in the nuclear establishment for years before 1986, documented internally, never corrected, and never disclosed to the operators, stayed largely outside the courtroom. The men who classified the flaw outranked the men who fell into it. The roof was cleared by biorobots. The dock was filled the same way. Other faces sat further up, in the ministries and the institutes and the Politburo commissions, the meetings of late April and May 1986, whose minutes, where they survive, show men receiving accurate assessments and issuing managed ones. Some of those records have surfaced. Researchers have spent careers on them. Names are known to history. Accountability, in any formal sense, never arrived for most of them. The state they served dissolved, and its obligations were declared dissolved with it. And some faces will never be named, because the third wall, time, has done its work. The instruction that became Valentina's chemical exposure passed through hands that left no signature. The decision that turned dose records into quotas was distributed across 1,000 desks, each clerk only following the form. This is the final sophistication of the machine, and I want you to see it clearly. A system can be built in which the lie is everywhere and the liar is nowhere, in which every individual merely complied, and the crime as a whole was committed by no one. Silence has a face. But the system's deepest defense is to make the face a crowd. Our answer, the only answer journalism has ever had, is the one this series has been performing for 3 episodes now. You name what can be named. You document what can be documented. You record the widow and the roofman and the engineer who buried helicopters. And you state plainly, on the record, for whoever holds the archive next, the uncertainty was manufactured. The records were corrupted at the source. The men were spent and then disputed. It was a decision. It had authors. And the passage of 40 years has changed the difficulty of saying so. It has not changed the truth of it.
Let me bring the threads together. 600,000 people were mobilized to contain what the state would not name. They cleared a roof in 60-second relays under a word: Biorobots, that told you everything about how they were valued. They dug a tunnel that may not have been needed in heat that should not have been survivable. They flew the open throat of the core. They washed the villages and shot the waiting dogs. And while they did it, an architecture of paper was built around them. Diagnoses redirected, doses recorded as quotas, registries scattered, so that for the rest of their lives, their own bodies would be inadmissible as evidence. They destroyed the evidence and cited the silence as proof. The children's thyroids broke through the wall because some signals are too specific to bury. The blood of the liquidators, read by scientists decades later, said more than the paper ever admitted. The widow keeps the truth the file refused. The count is not 0. Next week, the series moves outward, beyond the zone, beyond the Union. Because the management of Chernobyl's truth was not an exclusively Soviet project. The radiation crossed borders in the first week, and the impulse to reassure crossed them just as quickly. We will look at what Western governments and international bodies knew in May 1986, what their own populations were told about the cloud that passed over them, and how the comfortable number, 4,000, came to be the world's official memory of this event. The cover-up had a second act. It was multilingual. I want to end with the helicopter engineer, the man who serviced the machines that flew the core and watched them buried in the graveyards of the zone. At the end of our interview in 1996, I asked him what he wanted history to record. He thought about it for a long time. He was a careful man, the kind who tightens every answer before releasing it. He said, "Write that we went. Whatever they knew and didn't tell us, we went. The lie was theirs, the going was ours. The lie was theirs, the going was ours. 600,000 times over, the going was ours." This is the final frequency. The signal returns in 7 days. The count is not 0. Keep it that way.